In November 1979, Iranian students stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran. They seized the compound, took dozens of Americans hostage, and humiliated the most powerful intelligence agency on Earth. The world watched in shock, wondering how an ironclad American ally had transformed into a crucible of absolute, unyielding hatred. But the students inside the compound knew exactly what they were doing. Their fury had a specific return address. To protect their geopolitical interests in the Middle East, the CIA didn't just fund the Shah's secret police, they built it. They trained it in American tradecraft, and they deliberately turned a blind eye while it tortured and murdered thousands of dissidents in basement cells across Tehran. Its name was SAVAK. This is the story of how the CIA built a monster, ignored every warning sign, and eventually lost everything. 1957. Camp Peary, Virginia. The guarded compound the intelligence community calls simply the farm. Central Intelligence Agency instructors welcome a new class of foreign students. They are not British. They are not NATO allies. They are officers of SAVAK, the Iranian secret service the Americans have just helped build from scratch. These men have been handpicked by a regime that owes its existence to Washington. 4 years earlier, in 1953, CIA operative Kermit "Kim" Roosevelt led a small band of agents into Tehran with $2 million and a single objective: overthrow Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and restore Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to power. The operation succeeded. Western oil companies signed a 25-year agreement giving American interests a 40% share of Iran's petroleum. American arms flooded in. And now the Shah needed something else. Something to keep his grip on a population that had not asked to be ruled by him. He needed a secret police force. The CIA was happy to provide one. 4 years earlier, in a 1953 covert coup, the CIA had overthrown Iran's prime minister to install the Shah. Now, to ensure no one ever took their new prize back, Washington needed to give him an instrument of absolute control. At the farm, the institutional culture surrounding these SAVAK recruits was blunt. One instructor from that era told his class that on occasions it had been necessary to physically eliminate someone who was a threat to the agency. This was not a whispered confession. It was curriculum. The training pipeline covered counterintelligence methods, surveillance tradecraft, and interrogation techniques drawn from the KUBARK manual tradition, the CIA's own classified playbook for breaking human beings. The SAVAK officers absorbed everything. They learned how to identify threats, how to monitor populations, how to extract information from prisoners. And they learned something else, something no manual needed to spell out: that their American patrons would not ask difficult questions about how these skills were applied. They returned to Iran and built one of the most feared secret police forces in the world. Political opposition to the Shah's regime was completely forbidden. Student organizers, labor activists, intellectuals, clerics, anyone who questioned the throne faced the same machinery. Protesters were tortured. Dissidents were murdered. SAVAK operated with absolute impunity, answering only to the Shah himself and, through him, to the power that had created the monster in the first place. The West did not just turn a blind eye. It had built the instrument of repression with its own hands. The CIA had not merely trained a foreign intelligence service. It had exported its darkest institutional instincts into a country where no oversight existed, no congressional committee would ever review the results, and no journalist could safely ask what happened in SAVAK's basement interrogation rooms. Every technique taught at Camp Peary metastasized inside Iran without constraint. The monster's birth was deliberate, it was funded, it was professionally managed. And for 2 decades, Washington considered it a success. But the CIA did not train SAVAK out of friendship. There was something hidden in the mountains of northern Iran that made the Shah's survival worth any price. The reason was not ideology. It was not even oil. It was something far more specific, hidden at 7,000 feet in the mountains of northern Iran. High in the Elburz range, near the Soviet border, the CIA built something it could not afford to lose. Signals intelligence listening posts at Kabkan and Shah, aimed directly at the heart of the Soviet Union. These were not diplomatic gestures or symbolic installations. They were billion-dollar ears, positioned to intercept Soviet missile telemetry from the test site at Tehran. Every rocket the Soviets launched, every warhead trajectory they refined, was captured by antennae perched on Iranian soil. This was Project TACKSMAN, and in the logic of the Cold War, its data was priceless. It told Washington what Moscow could hit, how fast, and how accurately. And here is what that meant for everything else. These installations made the Shah's survival America's top strategic priority. Not friendship, not shared values. Cold mathematical calculus. The intelligence infrastructure held the moral conscience hostage. Because if the Shah fell, the listening posts fell with him. And if the listening posts fell, the United States would go partially deaf to Soviet nuclear capability at the worst possible moment in the arms race. So every report of SAVAK torture that crossed a desk at Langley was weighed against the data streaming from those mountain antennae. Every whisper of political murder, every account of prisoners wired to metal bed frames in Evin prison, was quietly measured against the strategic value of Soviet missile tracking. The Shah knew it. Washington knew it. And the calculation always came out the same way. This was the bargain. A nation's freedom traded for a frequency. The Iranian people's right to political expression, to dissent, to live without fear of their own secret police, exchanged for signals intelligence on rocket trajectories. The listening posts were the real reason the CIA tolerated everything SAVAK did. Not because the agency lacked information about the brutality, it had the information. It simply decided year after year that the information from the mountains mattered more than the screams from the basements. The Shah understood his leverage perfectly. He was not just an ally. He was the landlord of America's most sensitive intelligence real estate, and landlords set terms. When the Shah wanted weapons, he got weapons. When he wanted silence about SAVAK, he got silence. When he wanted the CIA to look the other way while his secret police crushed every opposition movement in the country, from communists to Democrats to religious leaders, the agency looked the other way, because the alternative was unthinkable. Walk away from the Shah, and you walk away from the frequencies. The CIA had built Iran's most feared secret police, armed its patron, and then chained itself to both. It was a dependency that ran in two directions, and it was deepening every year. Through the 1960s and into the 70s, SAVAK became something more than a secret police force. It became the Air Iranians Breathed. A presence felt in every university lecture hall, every union meeting, every newspaper office, every sermon. You did not have to see SAVAK to know it was there. Everyone knew. Everyone was afraid. The organization infiltrated every layer of Iranian society with methodical precision. Student groups at Tehran University were honeycombed with informants. Labor unions that dared organize were broken apart before their first real meeting. Journalists learned quickly which stories could be told and which would get you dragged from your home at 3 in the morning. Even the clergy were not safe. SAVAK monitored mosques, tracked sermons, catalogued the names of anyone who whispered dissent in the language of faith. Political opposition of any kind was met with a simple escalating formula: surveillance, then intimidation, then imprisonment, then torture, then, when necessary, death. The techniques bore the fingerprints of their American training. systematic interrogation methods drawn from CIA counterintelligence doctrine, surveillance networks modeled on the apparatus taught at Camp Peary, a counterintelligence structure built to identify, isolate, and destroy threats before they could organize. The monster the CIA had built was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was doing it with terrifying efficiency. Iranians lived in a state of pervasive, corrosive fear. Everyone knew someone who had been taken, a cousin, a professor, a neighbor who asked the wrong question. The name SAVAK itself became synonymous with terror, a word spoken only in whispers, if spoken at all. To be summoned to Evin prison was to disappear into a system where the rules of civilization simply stopped applying. And throughout this period, the CIA's relationship with SAVAK did not weaken. It deepened. The agency was not simply a distant creator admiring its work from Langley. It was an active intelligence partner, sharing information, exchanging operational methods, treating SAVAK as a trusted extension of its own apparatus in the region. Every year, the collaboration grew more intertwined. Every year, the reports of brutality grew louder. And every year, Washington chose not to hear them. Because the monster was useful. It kept the Shah in power. And keeping the Shah in power kept something else running, something hidden high in the Elburz mountains that mattered more to Langley than any number of Iranian lives. By the mid-1970s, SAVAK had crushed every visible form of opposition in Iran. But there was one force it could not silence, and it was speaking from exile, on cassette tapes smuggled into every mosque in the country. By 1976, a voice was rising across Iran. It crackled through smuggled cassette tapes passed hand to hand in bazaars and slipped under doors in working-class neighborhoods. It thundered from mosque loudspeakers in cities the Shah's modernization program had left behind. It spoke of justice, of Islam, of revolution, and it was reaching millions. The voice belonged to Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, and while his sermons set Iran on fire, the CIA was listening to someone else entirely. The agency had built itself into a corner. When President Jimmy Carter appointed Admiral Stansfield Turner to lead the CIA in 1977, Turner arrived with a mandate to reshape the institution. He slashed the number of operatives from several thousand to just 300. Covert operations dropped to 2 or 3 a year. The emphasis shifted entirely to electronic espionage, to signals intelligence, to the kind of data that could be captured by machines instead of people. The timing could not have been worse. At the precise moment Iran's streets were filling with fury, the CIA lost its eyes on the ground. No case officers in the bazaars, no assets in the mosques, no one reading the mood of a nation tearing itself apart. And what replaced human intelligence was something far more dangerous than ignorance. It was false confidence. The CIA had become dependent on SAVAK itself for intelligence on Iranian domestic conditions. Think about what that means. The agency that had built Iran's most feared secret police was now relying on that same secret police to tell it whether Iran was stable. SAVAK reported to the Shah. The Shah believed his own grip was firm. SAVAK told the CIA what the Shah believed, and Langley accepted it as ground truth. This was the catastrophic closed loop. A dictator describing his own stability to the intelligence service that had helped him build the machinery of control. Every assessment recycled through the same distorted lens. Analysts at Langley read SAVAK's reports and saw a country under control. They ignored the furious street protests. They dismissed the cassette tapes of Khomeini's sermons circulating by the millions. They discounted the strikes paralyzing Iran's oil industry. Their sole source said the Shah would survive, and the agency backed him to the last. It was one of the most consequential analytical failures in CIA history. The monster they had nurtured had blinded them completely. The CIA had built the perfect trap, and walked into it themselves. By the time anyone at Langley realized the Shah was finished, there were already millions of people in the streets of Tehran demanding everything America had built in Iran be torn down. January 1979. The Shah of Iran boarded a plane and left his country for the last time. He told reporters he was going on vacation. He never came back. 26 years of American investment in his regime, billions of dollars in arms sales, decades of intelligence cooperation collapsed in weeks. The monster the CIA had built, fed, and protected was suddenly homeless, and everything Washington had staked on his survival was falling like dominoes across the Iranian landscape. High in the Elburz mountains, the crisis became operational. The CIA listening posts at Kabkan and Beirut, those billion-dollar installations that had justified every compromise, every blind eye turned to SAVAK's torture chambers, were now exposed. Revolutionary forces were sweeping north. There was no time for orderly withdrawal, no time for careful dismantling. CIA technicians activated emergency protocols. They wired the facilities with demolition charges and destroyed them rather than let them fall into revolutionary hands. The most sophisticated signals intelligence installations in the Middle East, the very reason Washington had tolerated a secret police force that tortured its own citizens, were now rubble. The strategic asset and the moral liability were destroyed simultaneously. Every frequency the CIA had used to monitor Soviet missile tests at Tehran, every antenna calibrated to intercept telemetry from deep inside the Soviet Union, all of it abandoned to the mountain winds. The calculus that had held America's moral conscience hostage for 2 decades no longer added up. The equation was zero. On February 1, 1979, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini stepped off a chartered Air France jet at Tehran's Mehrabad airport. Millions flooded the streets to welcome him. The reception was rapturous, electric, and deeply hostile to everything American. Within weeks, the new Islamic Republic declared the United States its primary enemy. Not a rival, not a competitor, its enemy. Everything the CIA had lost was now in hostile hands. The networks, the contacts, the infrastructure, the relationships built over a quarter-century of covert operations in Iran. Everything except the secrets they had wired to explode. The agency that had once shaped Iranian politics from the shadows, that had handpicked a secret police force and trained its officers at Camp Peary, now had almost no visibility into what was happening inside the country. Turner's cuts had left them with a skeleton crew. SAVAK, their sole intelligence pipeline, had been dissolved. The closed loop was not just broken. It had never existed in any meaningful sense. The CIA was blind, deaf, and exposed in a country that now burned American flags as a national pastime. The listening posts were gone. The Shah was gone. But the CIA still had people inside Iran, dozens of them working behind the walls of the United States Embassy in Tehran. They were about to become the most visible symbols of American humiliation in a generation. On the morning of November 4, 1979, the bill came due. Hundreds of Iranian students surged over the walls of the United States Embassy in Tehran. They cut through locks, overwhelmed the Marine Guards, and poured into the compound. Inside, they found what they were looking for: American diplomats, intelligence officers, and CIA operatives. 66 Americans were seized. The students blindfolded them, bound their wrists, and paraded them before cameras. CIA men were taken hostage inside their own compound, in a building that had once served as the nerve center of American influence over Iran. The bitter irony was precise. The students' fury had a specific return address: SAVAK. 2 decades of CIA-backed brutality, of torture chambers and political murders, of a secret police force that operated with absolute impunity, all of it had been catalogued in the collective memory of a nation. The instrument the CIA had built to secure American interests had become the instrument that destroyed them. Every technique taught at Camp Peary, every interrogation method passed to SAVAK officers, every report of abuse that Langley had quietly filed away in exchange for Soviet missile telemetry, it all came back. Not as an intelligence assessment, as a mob storming the gates. This was Blowback in its purest, most undeniable form. The monster the CIA had built and fed and protected did not just turn on its creators. It generated something worse, a righteous fury that no amount of diplomatic maneuvering could diffuse. The hostage crisis lasted 444 days. The world watched. Every evening, American news broadcasts led with the same images. Blindfolded hostages, burning flags, crowds chanting "Death to America." The CIA's most consequential failure was playing out on live television, and there was nothing Langley could do about it. They tried. In April 1980, the United States launched a rescue mission. The CIA was involved in the planning. It was described by virtually everyone who reviewed it afterward as a fiasco. Helicopters collided in the Iranian desert at a staging area called Desert 1. 8 American servicemen died in the fire and wreckage. The charred remains of the aircraft were displayed by the Iranians as trophies. The mission did not just fail, it humiliated the most powerful military on earth. The political consequences were immediate. President Jimmy Carter watched his presidency collapse under the weight of the crisis. The hostage ordeal became the defining image of American impotence. Carter lost the 1980 election to Ronald Reagan. The transfer of power happened on the same day the hostages were finally released, a coincidence so perfectly staged it felt like a final insult. The CIA had lost its listening posts. It had lost its operatives to captivity. It had lost its credibility. And it had lost a president. The hostages would eventually come home. But the blowback from Iran was not finished. It was about to metastasize across the entire Middle East, and the next CIA officers caught in its path would not survive. The blowback did not stop at the Iranian border. It followed the CIA wherever it went. The overthrow of the Shah had seriously weakened America's position across the entire Middle East, triggering a regional chain reaction the agency had not anticipated. Pro-Iranian Islamic groups, fueled by aggressive anti-Americanism, saw the revolution as proof that Washington's allies could be toppled. The CIA had built its monster in Iran. Now the monster's offspring were spreading. On April 18, 1983, a suicide bomber drove a truck packed with explosives into the United States Embassy in Beirut, Lebanon. The blast killed 63 people. Among the dead were several CIA officers, including Robert Ames, the agency's most experienced Middle East analyst. Ames had spent years cultivating sources across the region. A single detonation erased him, and half a decade of institutional knowledge in seconds. The CIA's Beirut station was effectively destroyed. His replacement was William Buckley. In March 1984, Buckley was kidnapped outside his Beirut apartment by an Iranian-backed group. He was the CIA's station chief, the most senior American intelligence officer in Lebanon, and he was taken off the street in broad daylight. Buckley was tortured. He was interrogated for months. He eventually died in captivity. The agency that had once taught SAVAK its methods now watched helplessly as those methods were turned against one of its own. The desperation to recover Buckley drove the CIA into one of the most damaging scandals in its history. The agency entered secret arms for hostages negotiations with the very Iranian regime that had humiliated them, that had stormed their embassy, that had held their people for 444 days. The operation involved Oliver North, Israeli intermediaries, and covert logistics networks. It became known as the Iran-Contra affair, and when it unraveled, it exposed an agency willing to sell weapons to its sworn enemy to save a single officer. The man they were trying to save was already dead. There is a word intelligence professionals use when an operation destroys the very interests it was designed to protect. The word is blowback, and Iran is its dictionary definition. Circle back to where this started. Camp Peary, Virginia, 1957. CIA instructors teaching Iranian officers how to surveil, interrogate, and eliminate. Those officers returned home and built one of the most feared secret police forces the world has ever seen. The CIA tolerated every atrocity because of listening posts in the mountains. It became dependent on its own creation for intelligence about the country it was supposed to understand. It ignored every warning sign of revolution. And when the revolution came, it lost everything. The Shah, the listening posts, the embassy, Robert Ames, William Buckley, its credibility across the region, and any moral authority to shape what came next. The agency's own analysts would later acknowledge a devastating truth. The CIA had replaced a democratic government with a dictatorial leader, believing it would reduce Soviet influence. The result was the precise opposite. The monster they built in Iran did not just devour its creators' interests. It reshaped the entire Middle East into a landscape of permanent hostility toward the power that had set the whole chain of events in motion. The CIA built Iran's most feared secret police. Then it lost everything.